As I'm sure you are all aware by now, in what was his greatest escalation of military force since assuming the presidency late Thursday night, Donald Trump approved a drone strike to kill Qasem Soleimani, the head military leader of Iran and leader of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Force, or Quds Force. Now, Soleimani was wildly popular in his country, considered to have popularity somewhere between 70 and 75% in some polls. Now, Soleimani was also considered to be essentially second in charge of the country, at least practically speaking, and possibly by some to be considered a potential successor. Now, as this news was breaking, Tucker Carlson was on Fox News, and he reacted to it. And as far as I can tell, as far as Fox News is concerned, it's pretty good. There are moments in there where you can be like, "Hey, wait a minute, that wasn't right," and he does say things in there which are questionable. But overall, in terms of Fox News, in terms of Tucker Carlson, overall, I was happy with it. So I do want to show you that video. But real quick, when it comes to this video that I'm making, I decided to break it up into different parts because I felt like that would just make more sense for me organizationally. But so what I've done is I put timestamps for the various parts of the video in the description. So if you want to just kind of skip around, you can. Obviously, I'd prefer if you watch the whole thing. Watch time is a good thing for me. But if you do just want to skip around, you can do that. So, but anyway, here is Tucker Carlson.
Now, again, there's been virtually no debate or even discussion about this, but America appears to be lumbering toward a new Middle East war. And we have to say it's one that official Washington has wanted for decades. For example, disgraced National Security Advisor John Bolton has made it his life's mission to start a war with Iran. And tonight, Bolton may be finally getting his wish. Should you be happy about that? That's the question. Well, the last time we took John Bolton's advice in the region, Iran became far more powerful than it was before we took John Bolton's advice. Why? Because things are never quite as simple as they claim they are in Washington. These very same people tell us the real threat is Iran. Well, they're liars. They don't care about you. They don't care about your kids. They're reckless and incompetent. And you should keep all of that in mind as war with Iran looms closer tonight. Kurt Mills is a senior writer at the American Conservative. He joins us now. So, Kurt, this is unfolding even as we speak. Where could it go from here?
Well, like you said, if you liked the Iraq War, Tucker, we're back with the sequel, the Iran War. I would say the deep concern is, look, a general in the Iranian forces being assassinated is not necessarily something to mourn or begrudge the U.S. getting involved in.
That's
but
right.
The question is, though, is this a Franz Ferdinand moment? Is this a situation where a great power gets involved with a middle-tier power and gets the world into a world war? Iran, I think, is a problem for the U.S. and its allies in the region, but it is not an existential threat like China or Russia. China or Russia, particularly China, would love to see another decade or two of Americans my age dying in the sand for no particular purpose.
Well, that's exactly it. It's not that anyone, I think, in the United States has particular affection for Iran or trusts its government, much less the Revolutionary Guard or the Quds forces. Of course not. But it's the intemperance with which the foreign policy establishment in Washington describes the threat that I think makes sensible people nervous, that Iran is the greatest threat we face. I mean, it's so prima facie absurd that it makes you wonder what their actual agenda is.
It's a joke. It's a joke. I mean, I think the real question is, why do we still have troops there? So you see the Baghdad embassy protests. And to be clear, this is not just an embassy. This is a fortress. It's been a fortress since we took out Saddam in 2003. And American troops there, if we're not going to re-annex the country, are effectively hostages, what I think would be a tragedy in the Middle East. Iran is not Iraq. It's twice as big. It'd be twice as bad. We're weaker than we were 16 years ago. If President George W. Bush struggled to win re-election in 2004, if Trump does this, he's cooked.
I think that's right. Kurt Mills, great to see you tonight. Thank you for that.
Thanks.
So you just saw at the end there, Tucker agreeing with the claim that if Donald Trump does this, tries to initiate a war with Iran, that he is, quote, cooked, that he's absolutely going to lose the election, that he's done for, possibly going to lose the election quite badly. Now, what I find really interesting about this is that it actually runs a little bit counter to a narrative that we've been seeing emerge on the left, which is that Donald Trump is doing this as a kind of distraction, that he's doing this possibly even to kind of rouse up nationalist concerns in order to ultimately win him the election. Now, here's my take on it. After, I've been reading about Donald Trump now endlessly for the past many years since he's won, since he announced that he would run. And I've begun to become personally just kind of, I've begun to become a little bit skeptical whenever I read claims of that, Donald Trump is out here doing kind of multi-layered thinking. So I don't know about that. I'm going to be agnostic on that claim. But here's what I will say. It does serve as a distraction. It does serve as a distraction from Donald Trump's impeachment, and it will possibly benefit him in that way. But here's where I do disagree. I disagree that ultimately it's going to be strategically effective in terms of him winning the White House, because the sort of basis of fact of the claim is that it is true. There have been a number of studies looking at the claim, looking at the fact that sort of after you initiate a war, or when you start a war initially, or when you start, propagandizing towards one, there is a kind of jingoist bounce, which does tend to help conservative parties. And that's just a trend that's been observed in America and in a number of at least Western countries. So that's sort of the basis of the fact of it. That's just kind of a long-standing fact, which has been observed. It's not a perfect trend. There are exceptions, but generally that is the case. But the thing about that is that really only applies when there's a clear and direct case made to the citizens why we're doing this, why we're at war, why our interests are at threat, or why our people are at threat. So I think that ultimately, whether or not it does help, first of all, I think that it's unlikely. The Iraq war was an absolute disaster, and I see no reason to think why a war with Iran would be any different. In fact, I think that it would be significantly worse. We're going to talk about, in this video, talk a little bit about some of the connections, possibly even with Russia, that could be involved in this conflict. But here's sort of the thing, though. It's going to really depend on whether or not and in what way the war and how Iran ultimately responds, whether or not this is going to help Donald Trump. And so it's going to be really important to see and to think about how they're ultimately going to respond, which I'm going to talk about later in this video. Because here's the thing. If Iran responds drastically, extremely drastically, by like attacking the homeland, which I don't believe that there's really any chance of that happening, or directly targeting high-ranking military officials of the U.S., that could be a case where it could end up rousing a kind of nationalist bent, and it could that could actually end up starting to help Republicans. Now, I doubt that that's going to happen. I suspect that we're going to see much more moderated responses from Iran. In which case, I think that ultimately any kind of military conflict is ultimately going to hurt the Republicans. But regardless of all of that, let's talk a little bit about how we got here, because that is going to ultimately help us understand how Iran might ultimately respond to this attack, and that is going to help us understand and tell us possibly whether or not the sort of future of these escalations and conflict might be the kind which will ultimately help Donald Trump. So, of course, in order to go the background, we could go all the way back to World War I and sort of hash it out all the way through. But let's just start with the invasion of Iraq, just for sort of simplicity's sake. So, if you remember with Iraq, it was led by Saddam, and Saddam was Sunni. Now, Iran is Shia. What does that mean? It means that the region was ultimately, at least partially, self-balancing. It meant that Iran would try to kind of do something, and then Iraq would be able to partially, sort of push back at least a little bit. And ultimately, what does that mean? Now, let's put on our neocon hats for a minute and pretend like we are neocons. What does that mean? It means that the United States is able to better project its interests in the region. It doesn't have to worry about whether or not they're able to they're able to more easily control oil movements and resources, et cetera, because there might be less direct opposition. Now, after the invasion of Iraq, which was really dumb from even a neocon perspective, because because it basically just foiled that for them. But after the invasion of Iraq, they replaced Saddam with ultimately a Shia leader, which ultimately, of course, then kind of connected itself at least partially with Iran, and that ultimately meant now that Iran is able to stronger project its interest in the region and basically be a better foil to the United States. And so what does that mean? It means the United States has to have more troops, have to have more force in the region if it wants to be able to, continue doing its imperialist things that it's doing over there, right? It needs to project more power if it wants to continue its imperialism. Just one example of Iran countering the United States with the Syrian civil war, for example, it actually was Qasem Soleimani who was involved in going in on Assad's side and defending him. In fact, actually, Assad probably would have lost the civil war independent of any kind of American intervention, probably would have lost the civil war had Iran not intervened to protect Assad. Because initially, actually, Obama was against the whole invading Syria. But then when Iran started getting involved in the conflict, that's when America was like, oh, we need to get involved, because then it started to look like Assad wouldn't be toppled, which of course is somehow a problem for them. Somehow a problem for them. We need to be involved everywhere. And so that ultimately led to, this long, terrible, terrible, terrible crisis in Syria that is in many respects still ongoing. Now, let's move a little bit into the sort of more recent background. So this whole thing really started with the Iran nuclear agreement, because actually initially Soleimani and a lot of the sort of troops in the Iraqi Shia militia actually both leading up to the negotiation and then during the initial stages of the negotiation had stopped a lot of the attacks because they were respecting it. They understood that if they started attacking, then it could foil a potential serious negotiation between the countries. And so even those militias, which are not wholly under the control of Iran, but like kind of sort of respond to them, it's a clear mess over there. A lot of them even didn't like. They were like, hey, we're not going to attack right now because we want to be able to give Iran the best negotiating position when it comes to the Iran nuclear treaty. And so ultimately, though, of course, as we know, Donald Trump pulled out of the nuclear treaty, pulled out of this treaty, which Iran was respecting. Iran was doing, doing the things that we needed. The United States is the one who violated the deal, and we broke our promise to them and enacted a number of serious sanctions, which absolutely crippled the Iranian, very devastating sanctions, leading to a number of protests in the streets because people are suffering very severely. And but Iran initially was actually still following the agreement all the way up till May of last year, of 2019. Iran was still complying with the agreement, hoping that they could, get international connections with other, maybe with Europe, and then hopefully maybe even the United States would come back to the table and end the sanctions. Now, in May, of course, Iran stopped complying with the sanctions stopped complying with the deal and began enriching uranium. Now, around this time, also Iran started interfering with a number of trade vessels in the region, which of course aggravated the United States. And then around later May and then June, there was also that incident with the drone where Iran struck down an American drone, which obviously did not make us happy. Which, by the way, almost led to Donald Trump initiating an airstrike in the region, which would have been completely devastating. But he did pull back from that at sort of the last minute. He changed his mind. But then and then, of course, there was also the Saudi oil fields, which Iran struck, which, by the way, surprised the international community with the accuracy of the missile strike, which is, I think, very relevant for how Iran might respond. Prior to those airstrikes, the United States and the international community were not aware that Iran was even capable of the level of precision which were in those missile strikes, given the sort of distance, given the kind of range. Now, more recently, as you know, what happened was a U.S. contractor was killed from militia fire on a military base, leading Donald Trump ultimately to engage in airstrikes, which then led to, a number of protests in Iraq who were protesting the military, being in Iraq, which is something that Iraq has allowed for a long time, but very well, I suspect, with this attack in Iraq and in a Baghdadi airport, it's quite possible that that may, it's very possible that that could go away, that Iraq will no longer allow U.S. citizens in the region. I think that that could be a possible Iraqi response. I wouldn't put it like super high on the possibility response, but I do think that it is a possible response. Now, of course, then after the attack on the embassy, Donald Trump Donald Trump issued the attack on Soleimani. So now then, giving the history, giving the background, what kind of response might we expect to see from Iran? And is that the kind of response which ultimately might help or hurt Donald Trump in the election? Here's my take. I don't think that we're going to see a direct and very serious aggressive aggression from Iran, though we will see a few strikes from Iran. We will see some of the precision missile strikes in key strategic areas from Iran. But Iran, at all costs, wants to avoid a direct conflict with the United States, where honestly they know that they would lose. One thing that we will probably see is there is certainly very increased support right now in Iraq to get the United States to leave, at least public support. Whether or not that's ultimately going to pressure the government is another question, but I do suspect that we will see Iran diplomatic channels trying to ultimately pressure Iraq in order to, get that to happen, right? Get the United States to leave the region. And then I think that primarily we're going to see a lot of attacks from a lot of the militia groups, which are kind of, sort of, but not entirely, but like sort of indirectly in control from Iran, because doing that gives Iran the kind of out that they would need in order to avoid the direct confrontation that they want to avoid. One example of a group is actually Hezbollah. Now, Hezbollah is a little bit more detached than some of the other militia groups, but they are still kind of under the control of Iran. Now, it's an open question whether or not they would attack Israel or a United States interest in response to this. My guess is that they would attack a United States interest just because, it's more, the United States is the one who did the attack. And in recent months, we've been seeing Hezbollah trying to shy away a little bit from aggression with Israel, direct aggression with Israel, which has weakened them in the past, and so they'll probably attack a United States interest in the region. But something that we will definitely see, something that I'm very, very certain that we'll see, is a massive, a very significant uptick in the level of uranium enrichment. Remember, this whole thing started because of the Iranian nuclear deal being torn up. We're going to see a serious uptick. My guess is possibly all the way up to a critical 20% threshold, which, by the way, is still a far stretch from any kind of weapons grade uranium, but still a significant uptick towards that 19.75% threshold that would be seen as the United States would see that as a move of aggression. My guess is we're definitely going to see that. So, is this going to help or hurt Donald Trump in the election? I think it's going to hurt him. If Donald Trump tries to engage in this kind of conflict, it's not going to help him at all, because it's not going to be a direct conflict with a specific state actor. It's going to be a bunch of militia groups with a bunch of different, Middle Eastern names that, the average American has no idea how to pronounce. That's the kind of conflict which, Americans are sick of, we're tired of, we don't want to see it anymore. We're tired of spending trillions of dollars overseas fighting wars, against enemies that, nobody really seems to know the name of. That's the kind of thing that will absolutely lose Donald Trump in election. So anyway, that's the video. I just wanted to give kind of a breakdown of, what happened and whether or not I think this is ultimately going to help Donald Trump, because we've been seeing back and forth on both the left and the right on whether or not this is a good strategy for Donald Trump politically. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that, and I thought the best way to do that was to analyze the history of what happened and what kind of response we might see. If you have any thoughts, I'd appreciate it if you left them in the comments, and let me know what they are. So if you like the video, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button and consider subscribing. Thanks.